Let me get this straight. DLSS 4, which is a lot better than FSR, is just fake frames and destroying the game industry. But FSR is amazing and great. YouTubers aren't even hiding that they are being paid by AMD at this point. I'm seeing a lot of comments about fake frames and accusations of bias on reacting positively to FSR 4 and less positively to DLSS 4 multi-frame generation. I'm seeing that on a lot of channels, including mine. This is one comment that's pretty representative of a lot that I've seen, again, on my channel and others. And that's even though I don't actually even use the term fake frames myself, unless I'm like referring to what other people refer to them as, because I don't really like that term. And I've also never accused DLSS of destroying the game industry. I've discussed that in a nuanced way, whether optimization is, failing due to upscaling technologies. But anyway, I think a lot of times commenters on YouTube just associate stuff they've heard on various YouTube channels and just lash out at whichever particular channel they happen to be on at the time. But this video isn't so much about this commenter being a bad person or offending me. What this is actually about is the fact that I tried to actually reply to a number of these comments because I think what a lot of these are based on is a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between frame generation and upscaling. And I don't think that's entirely most gamers' fault, because NVIDIA and AMD have lumped both frame generation and upscaling technologies under the same branding label, DLSS for NVIDIA and FSR for AMD. And the thing is, upscaling and frame generation are not the same thing, and they both, although they both increase FPS. But they do it in very different ways and have different pros and cons. So lumping those two completely different technologies under the same label has had the effect of causing many gamers to misunderstand conversations about these technologies and the nuances of their distinctions and pros and cons. And there's a lot of other stuff about the specific CES goings on and whatnot about this particular comment. But the point is, I think it's going to be beneficial to the audience, especially those just tuning in now because we have new GPUs coming out, to make it extremely clear what actually is the distinction between frame generation and upscaling, even if both of them get called DLSS or both of them get called FSR. So let's make it extremely clear what each of these is doing, why that leads to different pros and cons, and why they should actually have different use cases, and why I may be more excited about improvements to upscaling than I am about improvements to frame generation. So let's start with upscaling. So upscaling increases FPS, frames per second. It does this by making the GPU's job easier by reducing the resolution that the game is rendering at, and then applying an upscaling algorithm, like DLSS or FSR, etc., Intel has XeSS, to try to make the lower resolution frames look like higher resolution frames. And these are not fake frames. They're increasing the FPS, the frames per second, in this way. By increasing the frames per second in this way, you're both increasing motion fluidity and responsiveness, which are the two main reasons why we want higher FPS. Traditionally, you wanted higher frames per second in a game because it makes it look more fluid on your screen and it makes the game more responsive to your input, which especially helps in competitive games, but even in single-player games, makes games just feel better to play. So upscaling actually has both of those benefits, but it does have a downside. The downside to improving frame rates using upscaling is that the upscaled image will often not look as good as the truly high-resolution image does. So for example, if you're playing on a 4K monitor, but using DLSS performance, the game is rendering the game at 1080p, which is drastically faster and gets you much a higher frames per second than rendering at 4K would. But the 1080p image upscaled to a 4K output doesn't look as good as an actual native 4K image. So improvements to the quality of that upscaling process are extremely exciting to me, because imagine a world where upscalers get to the point where you can't tell the difference between an upscaled image and the native image. That would be literally free performance. But we're not there yet. And FSR has been way worse than DLSS in this regard. That is why I was so excited about the image quality improvements to FSR 4. And it's also why I was extremely excited about the improvements NVIDIA has shown to its new transformer model for DLSS upscaling. It looks great. And I almost always, by the way, use DLSS when playing games myself, but I'll talk more later in this video about use cases for this, both my recommendations and what I actually do personally. When do I use upscaling? When do I use frame generation? All that kind of stuff. But first, let's contrast this description about how upscaling works with how frame generation works, because then we'll see some of the differences in pros and cons use cases. So, frame generation also increases the frames per second on your screen. So in that sense, both upscaling and frame generation do the same thing. But they achieve this in such different ways that I'm generally less excited about frame generation and use it less frequently than I am about upscaling. But I'm still generally positive about frame generation. So using frame generation to increase FPS increases the motion fluidity of the game. When you look at it on your monitor, there's more frames, so motion looks smoother. But it does not make a game more responsive to user input. And that's because of the way it works. The way frame generation increases FPS is by taking 2 frames that the game has actually rendered and uses them to guess what happens in between. And those guesses are generated frames, and those are what some people refer to as fake frames. I don't actually like that term because in reality, you are getting an additional frame on your screen. There are more frames on your display. It is a frame. But it's not responsive to user input, and I think that's what people mean when they say fake frames. But I personally try to steer away from that terminology, because it is a frame. There is another frame on your screen. But this does mean that the game engine is not actually rendering faster. And it's also not able to respond more quickly to user input, although you do see more frames on your screen. So we can see that it only has one of the 2 benefits that we normally associate with high frames per second, which is, why we usually want to have high frames per second. We're getting the increased motion fluidity, but we are not getting the better responsiveness. So we can, so let's contrast then how a game that's achieved 60 frames per second, but done it in 2 different ways, is actually an extremely different experience. So a game that has achieved a 60 frames per second output through the use of frame generation will look as fluid as a normal 60 frames per second, if you ignore any image quality artifacts that were introduced, but we'll talk about that later. But let's assume it was perfect. There were no image quality artifacts introduced. Then you get 60 frames per second on your screen. The motion fluidity will be 60 frames per second. However, it will only feel as responsive as a game running at 30 frames per second if you're talking about a game traditionally running normally. Whereas let's contrast that to a game that is running at 60 frames per second, but has achieved that using upscaling. In upscaled 60 FPS, we'll have the motion fluidity of 60 FPS because there are 60 frames per second being displayed on your monitor. And it will actually feel as responsive as a normal 60 FPS because the game engine is actually rendering at 60 frames and responding to user input on those 60 frames. It's all being updated in real time because 60 FPS achieved through upscaling is actually 60 FPS in normal gaming. The only difference is the image quality of those 60 frames compared to if they had actually been rendered at a higher resolution. And this is why I'm more excited about upscaling, and I use it more frequently myself than I am about frame generation. Now, the new DLSS for multi-frame generation has a compounding issue. So let's imagine the same scenario where we are achieving 60 frames per second. But this time, we've achieved it through the new ×4 frame generation mode. So if I've achieved 60 FPS by doing this, it means that the game engine is actually only rendering 15 frames per second, and it can only respond to our inputs at that rate. So the game is only having 15 frames per second of responsiveness, even though you are achieving 60 frames per second on your monitor. Now, none of this means that frame generation isn't good or isn't useful, but it means that you need to already have a high enough frame rate before you turn it on to not really need more responsiveness. And all you're really looking to do is make motion look smoother on your high refresh rate display, which is why I think that frame generation technologies should better be understood as motion smoothing technologies and not performance, because I associate performance in a game with the game being more responsive and having more motion fluidity. Now, let's also be clear that both upscaling and frame generation, if we go beyond the motion fluidity and the responsiveness, there's also the image quality artifacts, and they produce different types. So with frame generation, again, there's 2 rendered frames, and then they guess what happens in between. That guessed or generated frame, which some people call fake frames, can have errors in them because it's guessing what happened in between. It might not be correct. Now, the thing is, though, that these generated frames can be easier to generate or harder to generate, which means they could have more errors or less errors. In a fast-moving scene, there's a larger difference between the 2 actually generated frames. That can happen when there's quick mouse movement or something moving quickly on the screen or fast camera cuts, things like that. That means there's a large difference between the 2 frames the game is working off of to decide what happened in between, and so it's more likely to have errors. Also, the lower your base frame rate is, the fewer real frames you have per second, which means the larger difference there's likely to be between the two actually rendered frames, which means the guessed frame in between, again, will have a harder job guessing accurately. So that's yet another reason why frame generation is only really useful when you have an already high enough base frame rate, because the image quality artifacts will be worse the lower your frame rate is. But also, again, we've talked about the image quality issues potential in frame generation, but as stated earlier, upscaling also can have image quality issues when the result of the upscale doesn't look as good as a native image. So these are different types of image quality issues that you get with frame generation or with DLSS. Now, with either method, there is no free lunch, right? There's always a downside. In upscaling, the downside is image quality. In frame generation, the downsides are image quality and you're not actually getting more responsiveness. But this also means that any improvements to the image quality of these technologies makes them inherently more useful and is a good thing and should be celebrated. But this also explains why I'm more excited by improvements to upscaling than I am by improvements to frame generation. Because again, let's imagine a perfect scenario. Imagine an extreme case where frame generation is solved. It has 0 artifacts. It works perfectly. Whether or not that's realistic is beside the point. What I'm saying is, imagine that the guessed frame in between the 2 rendered frames is perfect. It's exactly what the game would have rendered. Now, in this perfect scenario, the game is still not more responsive. And that's the catch, right? That's why I'm not as excited about frame generation as I am about upscaling. Frame generation cannot make a game more responsive. It just can't. The best thing we could ever get out of it is a lot more frames, making the game even more fluid on your screen, and no artifacts. And those are good things to achieve. And DLSS 4 and its multi-frame generation supposedly is improving on both of those things. NVIDIA is claiming better motion fluidity and is claiming, because of the additional frames, but then is also claiming fewer image quality artifacts, more accuracy. That's great. But again, frame generation will never make a game more responsive. It can't. And so now again, compare that to our imagined perfect upscaler. If a perfect upscaler existed, then the game would render faster because it's rendering at a lower internal rendering resolution, which increases the frame rate. And it does it with no decreased image quality if the upscaler was perfect. That would be an actual free lunch. In other words, perfect upscaling would mean actual free performance, both responsiveness and motion fluidity, and if the upscaling was perfect, there would be no downside, since image quality concerns are the only actual downside to upscaling. And perfect frame generation can never achieve this goal. Even if frame generation moves into like frame extrapolation, where you're like trying to guess what frame will come next before actually having to render it. Now, that'll still get you additional frames on your screen, but I still don't think that would make the game more responsive to user input. And imagine like in a competitive game, an enemy coming in off the screen. If he hasn't come in off the screen yet in the actual render of the game, then the extrapolated frame could never guess that that happened, and you will never see the enemy come in off the edge of the screen sooner. Whereas the game actually rendering more frames will get you that next frame sooner, right? Do you see what I'm saying? Frame generation cannot increase responsiveness. Now, how about we go back to some of this bias accusation, right? So let's jump back to, this is all in the context of things like this, like my headline for DLSS and the new RTX series cards. I made 2 videos on the topic, one right after the other. Did NVIDIA lie? RTX 5070, 4090 performance, DLSS 4, massive frame rate increase. But is there a catch? The DLSS 4 problem. So there was a reason I had to make titles like this, whereas my reaction to the FSR4 information was much more positive. FSR4 looks amazing. However, I did also say WTF AMD and was also very critical. So I wouldn't even say this is completely positive reaction. But then we get the comments, let me get this straight, DLSS 4, which is a lot better than FSR, is just fake frames and destroying the gaming industry. But FSR is amazing and great. YouTubers aren't even hiding that they are being paid by AMD at this point. So, in the context of what was announced at CES, which is what these videos are about, this then makes some sense why this headline is more positive. Also in the context of the fact that I'm more positive about upscaling improvements than I am about frame generation improvements. So in NVIDIA's RTX 5070 announcement, they claimed it was as powerful as a 4090. But that was based entirely on frames per second comparisons, where the 5070 is achieving that frames per second through multi-frame generation, which is not supported on the 4090. So this is a misleading claim as best. It's not apples to apples, but even if you did say they're achieving the same frame rate, the 4090 is doing it with better responsiveness because of it's actually rendering more frames, whereas the 5070 is generating more frames to achieve the same frame rate, right? Anyway, that is why my videos about DLSS 4 and the 50 series announcement had to have less positive titles because I had to correct for that cutting through the BS marketing. Whereas in the FSR 4 video, there was no marketing claims at all. In fact, my WTF AMD was actually more about the fact that AMD wasn't really making any marketing claims about their new GPUs, and I thought that was a bit weird. Anyway, so the FSR 4 video could basically focus on the fact that, wow, FSR upscaling appears to be getting way better. That's exciting, cool. Whereas the videos about the NVIDIA announcements had to deal with the fact that we had to cut through some marketing BS. And then within these videos, I was extremely positive about the improvements to the DLSS upscaling model using the new transformer model. I just couldn't lead with that because the more important information to convey to my viewers is the fact that if you just took this at face value, you might make a uninformed purchasing decision. You're being misled. That had to be communicated. That would be dishonest to not communicate as my job, right? For trying to give you information about graphics cards. Anyway, So that's a lot of why my reaction here is different than my reaction here. It's in a very different context. And I'm positive, by the way, completely positive about DLSS 4. I just had to make sure people understood the catch about the 5070 performance. Frame generation's not the same thing as upscaling. It doesn't improve responsiveness. It's a little unfair. If you actually watch the videos, let's make this clear. I'm very positive about the 50 series from what we know about it so far, and I'm very positive about DLSS 4 multi-frame generation, although I still have some questions and haven't got to experience it myself. It sounds good on paper. And then I'm also extremely happy with what we've seen with the transformer model improving the upscaling, and I'm more interested in upscaling. Now, as I promised earlier in this video, let's talk a bit about the use cases of upscaling versus frame generation. Since we're kind of on that topic, why not? So here's the thing. Upscaling, like I said, I feel like is more useful because it's causing a game to actually run faster. It's making it more responsive and more motion fluidity. It can be useful in both competitive games and single-player games as long as the image quality looks good enough to not bother you, right? Because that's the only downside to upscaling. It's the image quality. At higher resolutions, upscaling has more pixels to work with as input, so it often achieves a better looking output. So what I'm trying to say here is, when I game on a 4K display, which I usually do at home, and I have a very powerful GPU, I do use the RTX 4090, despite having a very powerful GPU, I will almost always use DLSS quality, at least, and sometimes more aggressively. Because at that output resolution, and DLSS quality's image quality is very good, it's almost free performance. It's not quite free performance, but close enough that I feel like the increase in performance is well worth the extremely minor hit to image quality. And if DLSS quality isn't giving me enough performance at 4K, I'll often try to go down to balanced mode or even performance mode, oftentimes before I try reducing any other graphic settings in the game. Now, on a 1440p display, I would make a little bit different choices on that. At work, I game on my lunch breaks a lot, and I have an RTX 4060 based PC, and I use a 1440p display. And I do that partially just because I have one and it's fun to use on my lunch break, but also it's kind of intentional. I feel like it's risky to get out of touch with with what kind of GPUs people actually use. So I think it's important for research to actually game on an RTX 4060 class GPU on a monitor resolution that a lot more people have, like 1440p, because it helps me be more informed about actually gaming on these mid-range cards and the kind of compromises people have to make and the experience that they get. Now, with that being said, gaming on the RTX 4060 on the 1440p display, I will almost always enable DLSS quality as one of the very first things that I'll do to get better performance. Sometimes I'll turn down ultra preset to high preset first, and if that's not enough, I'll usually kick on DLSS quality. But sometimes I'd actually do it first before even turning down any settings. Although I'd prefer not to upscale at all at 1440p if my performance was good enough. But realistically, on an RTX 4060, I usually would not consider it good enough without using upscaling at 1440p if I'm sticking to pretty high settings. Now, before I would go down to DLSS balanced or performance mode at 1440p, I would probably turn down a lot more graphic settings first. I'd probably go down as far as medium settings in most games before I would go any more aggressive than DLSS quality at 1440p. And I would try to avoid DLSS performance mode at 1440p unless I absolutely had to use it and I'd already turned down all the other settings I was willing to compromise and my performance still wasn't there. On a 1080p display, which I still try to game on frequently as well, using modest hardware to, again, make sure I understand the experience, I will usually turn down a lot of graphic settings before I'll touch upscaling. And then I wouldn't try to go any further than DLSS quality if I could possibly avoid it. Because beyond that, there's just not a lot of pixels to work with at that point, and I don't think the upscale looks very good. You're having too much of a hit to that image quality. Now, with frame generation, I find my situation to be very different because, first of all, if I'm playing a competitive game, I will not turn on frame generation. Because in this video so far, I've been saying for simplicity's sake that frame generation doesn't increase responsiveness. The reality is it has a very small decrease to responsiveness because of the overhead and the slight delay in outputting that generated frame compared to if you hadn't chosen to output the generated frame. So there's a very slight decrease to responsiveness, even compared to when compared to not using the generated frames. So in competitive games, I will not use frame generation. In non-competitive games, in single-player games, I find it to be pretty hit or miss. It depends on a couple of factors. First of all, I need to adjust graphics settings and upscaling settings to be at preferably 60 FPS or higher, although in certain games, using a 50 FPS baseline is all right. 40 FPS is really pushing it. I think some people would be fine there, some people wouldn't be. Personally, for me, it's a bit low. I like to be, like I said, at least 50 FPS, 60 FPS is better before kicking on frame generation. That's part of it. But even then, sometimes I kick on frame generation and I just have too many image quality artifacts. The quality of the generated frames just aren't good enough, and I go ahead and turn it back off. But I'll try it in most single-player games that have it, and then I'll turn it off in a lot of them, but leave it on in a lot of them as well. In a lot of games, the experience with frame generation on is better as long as you have a high enough base frame rate, but sometimes it's not, like I said, depending on how sensitive you are to those image quality artifacts from the frame generation. And that's where I'm at with frame generation. So I find frame generation to be sometimes useful, and I find upscaling to be almost always useful if you're on a high resolution display. So that's my overall feelings on all of this. The point about this destroying the gaming industry, that seems to be a big talking point that we might need to talk about in another video. I've actually done other videos a while back on that topic, and my conclusion wasn't that DLSS is destroying the gaming industry. But that's more related to the fact that are game developers getting lazy because of these technologies and choosing not to optimize games? But that's really a whole other topic. So I think some people hate these technologies for that reason. Anyway, so hopefully in this video, we have cleared up the difference between upscaling and frame generation, despite the fact that both of them can be called DLSS and both of them can be called FSR. And that I am generally much more positive about upscaling than I am about frame generation, although I'm positive about both. So hopefully that clears a lot of that up. And we've also cleared up why calling generated frames performance is at best a bit misleading and does warrant negative reaction to that kind of marketing claim. Anyway, I hope all of you guys found the video useful and/or interesting, and you have an excellent day.